By the way, you might notice that we've populated the PowerPoints with transliteration. And it would be lovely to get your feedback, whether that's a hindrance in your pure love of Hebrew. Does your eye go towards the left too quickly? Or whether it's a help, and whether there are more prayers that you'd like to see transliterated, and whether it's also a user-friendly mode of transliteration. I've kind of tried lots of different ways, and I'm still trying different ways to make it more. Anyway, give us your feedback for that. And the idea is to help people join in a little bit more, because we're quite inhibited with our masks and everything. But hopefully, we want to encourage people to join in with the prayers, Hebrew and English. So don't be shy. At a talk which I gave this week at the Belsize Library in Hampstead on what do the prophets have to teach us about social justice, a member of the audience asked this question: what was the position of the prophets towards those who didn't have faith? In my talk, I had explained the two fundamental aspects of prophetic teaching: that there was a covenant between God and the Israelite people, 1, and 2, that this covenant bound them to an ethical relationship with their fellow human beings. The short answer I gave to the question, surely an inadequate response, was not that the prophets addressed themselves to people without faith, but that the focus of their criticism was towards idolaters, those who worship false gods, and that by breaking the covenant with God, they had abrogated their responsibilities to each other, and particularly to the poor, the widow, and the stranger. For the prophets, there was no such thing as secular morality. God was, in the words of Jeremiah, the power that made for love, justice, and righteousness on earth. For many of us, that inseparable dual aspect of the covenant with God and with our fellow human beings remains vital. The ethical monotheism that Judaism gave to the world, and that the founders of liberal Judaism brought to the fore when they emphasized faith in one God and the primacy of ethics. For others, it is the second aspect of prophetic Judaism that alone is important. Morality, they say, can exist without a belief in God, or as one of my class het students, all of nearly 13, said, we've grown out of God. Just this morning, actually. The absence of faith does not make someone more likely to commit a crime. The atheist, after all, can be as altruistic as the one who professes a religion. But if the guiding principle for atheists, as some would suggest, is enlightened self-interest, I would want to ask whether that is sufficient to create the kind of society that goes above and beyond satisfying our own needs and desires, while at the same time doing just enough for others so that both the self and the other find benefit. That is not to denigrate those who claim to be without faith. I am sure that many in the audience at Belsize Library are engaged in efforts to mitigate the inequity in our society without the promptings of faith. And after all, the greatest teachers of the rabbinic period distilled Jewish teachings into one ethical commandment. What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor, for Hillel, and for Akiva, love your neighbor as yourself, This is the major principle of the Torah. As a small child growing up in this synagogue as a liberal Jew, the very first Hebrew text I was taught was the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Eternal One is our God, the Eternal God is one. And its second line, you shall love the Eternal God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your might. In those days, quite a long time ago now, our teachers had less diffidence in speaking about God and what God required of us. Micah's famous verse, another distillation of Hebraic wisdom, does not separate the question, what does the Eternal One require of you, from the answer, only to do justice and to love goodness and to walk modestly with your God. God's righteousness, justice, and compassion are the attributes which we are called upon to imitate in our relations with each other. Liberal Judaism today prides itself on its inclusiveness and openness. Let all who are thirsty come and drink. As a recent article in the Jewish Chronicle about Leicester Progressive Synagogue showed, more people than ever during these last 2 years have shown an interest in religion, and in liberal Judaism in particular. It is no exaggeration to say that our classes here at the LJS are larger than they have ever been, and perhaps that is because we are more accessible online, perhaps because people have had more time to do those things they've been contemplating for a long time, or perhaps because the need for a religion, for a community, for a belief in something beyond the material suddenly has become necessary and vital during these last 2 challenging years of the pandemic. And yet, it has to be said at the same time, there is a skepticism afoot that leads to an attrition of faith in God, however you define that God. Just as people are discovering Judaism, so others are leaving synagogues or choosing not to join communities because religion and the synagogue are, in the words of 2 recent individuals who wrote to resign from the LJS, no longer relevant to their lives. It's always a source of regret when people resign from the synagogue or indeed hesitate to join a community. And I sometimes wonder whether that diffidence in talking about faith, about working out the great theological questions in life, who is this God to whom we address our prayers? How can God be omnipotent and not eliminate all suffering and evil from the world? What happens to us after we die? Perhaps that diffidence weakens our attachment to something transcendent or immanent, eternal, something that is greater than ourselves and something that is deep within ourselves. Our Torah reading for today begins with God's instruction to Moses, Daber el bnei Yisrael, v'yikhu li teruma. Tell the Israelite people to take for me gifts. In an extraordinary midrash, rabbinic commentary, to that phrase, v'yikhu li teruma, take li, for me, gifts, the rabbis interpret the gifts not as the gold and silver and materials brought by the Israelites to construct the sanctuary, but as the Torah, given by God as a gift to the people Israel. And they contrast this transaction of God giving the Torah to Israel with other kinds of transactions. The Torah, that say the rabbis, is not a single article of gold and silver, such as you would buy in a shop, for its words are like silver tried in a crucible, and it is also like gold, for more to be desired are they than gold, as it says in the Psalms. The Torah is like fields and vineyards. And then comes this astonishing question. Can you conceive of a transaction in which the seller themselves is sold with their goods? And then we know what is about to come. This seller, the seller of the Torah, is not going to be easily parted from his goods. God says to Israel, I have sold you my Torah, but with it, as it were, I have also been sold. As it says, Vayikhu li, take me as a gift. They reread that little phrase, Vayikhu li terumah. God cannot bear to be separated from his Torah, even when he has given it away, sold it to the Jewish people. Please, do me a favor, says God. Have a room ready for me, that I may dwell with you, for I cannot leave my beloved Torah. Wherever you go, make for me a house in which I may dwell. As it says, V'asu li mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham, and let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them. Whether we believe in the old ancestral God of the patriarchs and matriarchs, or the God of the prophets, of justice, compassion, and forgiveness, whether we believe in the God who speaks out of the whirlwind in Job, whether we find God in the performance of the mitzvot, the commandments, or in deeds of loving kindness, or in the writings of the mystics, or in contemporary understandings that see God as the source of all existence, the ground of our being. However we believe in God, may we learn to acknowledge the dual aspect of our Judaism, our love of God, bound by the covenant at Sinai, and the responsibilities we bear towards each other. Kein Yehi Ratzon. May this be God's will, and let us say, Amen.